Before Mick Jagger was the strutting, lip-pouting, hip-shaking prophet of rock and roll, he was a hospital porter. Yes, imagine the same guy who would later sing in front of millions, but instead of stadium lights, he was pushing squeaky wheels down long, disinfectant-scented corridors. His audience? Grumpy nurses, sleepy doctors, and the occasional patient wondering why their orderly looked like he had a secret plan to conquer the world with rhythm. Picture young Mick in his hospital whites, his hair slightly rebellious, his eyes carrying the gleam of someone who was just waiting for life to break into song. His job was simple: move people from here to there. Beds, gurneys, wheelchairs, it was basically an endless conga line except without the music. Or maybe not, because Mick Jagger, even then, couldn't stop the music inside his head. Rumor has it that when he pushed patients through the hallways, he gave each gurney a rhythm. Left wheel squeak, right wheel thump. Squeak thump, squeak thump. It wasn't just transportation. It was the first rehearsal for rock anthems. And imagine the faces of the patients. "Nurse, why is this skinny kid giving my ride to the X-ray machine a drum beat?" Mick just winked. Nobody knew they were being wheeled into the early sketches of rock history. Every hallway was an arena. Every stretcher was a stage. The IV drip? A metronome. Working at the hospital wasn't glamorous. It was long hours, odd smells, and heavy lifting. But if you looked closely, Mick was rehearsing. He learned how to read a room. Literally. When you're rolling someone into surgery, you need timing, confidence, and a little flair. It's not so different from stepping on stage, except the stakes are slightly different. Instead of a missed note, it's, well, a missed vital sign. But hey, both require charisma, and that's where the seed of the Rolling Stone swagger was planted. Not in a smoky club, not in a dingy rehearsal space, but in the sterile corridors of a hospital. Jagger learned how to walk with rhythm, how to control a room with just a presence, and maybe how to sneak in a smile when things looked a bit too serious. Because one day, instead of pushing beds, he'd be pushing the entire world into a frenzy. While most people at the hospital saw Mick as that skinny kid who pushes beds too fast, he had a secret life brewing outside those disinfected walls. The hospital corridors were just his warm-up stage, but the real action was happening in his head and his record collection. See, Mick wasn't just moving patients around. He was plotting his escape from the world of latex gloves and bedpans into the universe of guitars, amplifiers, and screaming fans. Every time Mick carried someone to the X-ray department, he imagined the machine wasn't scanning bones, but scanning rhythms. Every time he picked up a tray of hospital food, he pretended it was a microphone. And when he had to clean up after a patient, the less glamorous part of the job, he convinced himself it was training for surviving rock and roll's messier side. Spoiler, it worked. But here's the thing, Mick's job also gave him discipline. Rock stars are famous for chaos, but you don't get to stadiums without learning some order. Hospital life meant he had to show up on time, follow rules, and keep a straight face when things got weird. And in hospitals, things always get weird. That training would later make him the kind of frontman who could keep a whole band of chaotic Rolling Stones rolling. Still, hospital porter life had its limits. Mick knew he wasn't born to fetch wheelchairs forever, so he began sneaking out with a secret weapon: music. He would meet up with Keith Richards, the partner in crime who would eventually become his eternal riff machine. Imagine the scene: Mick, still smelling faintly of disinfectant, showing up with a grin and saying, "Keith, mate, let's make some noise." They weren't thinking about fame yet. They were thinking about survival. And survival meant trading in stretchers for guitars. If the hospital corridors were a rehearsal space, then those first jams with Keith were the operating table where they stitched rock and roll together. Mick's gurney-pushing swagger became microphone swagger. The rhythm of the squeaky wheels turned into the rhythm of drums. Even the sound of a beeping heart monitor could be reimagined as a bass line. Mick was already practicing how to grab attention. Patients might not scream for an encore, but they did notice the kid with the restless energy. That same energy was about to burst out of the hospital and flood the world. Because sooner or later, the hospital had to let him go. And when they did, they weren't just losing a porter. They were accidentally releasing one of the greatest frontmen in history. The hospital may have taught Mick responsibility, but the stage was calling. And Mick, with that restless grin, was ready to answer. Leaving behind the hospital wasn't just quitting a job. It was like escaping from a sitcom he didn't sign up for. Imagine Mick hanging up his porter uniform for the last time. The squeaky shoes, the jangling keys, the endless, "Excuse me, sir, mind if I wheel you down this hall?" All traded for the unknown chaos of rock and roll. It was the equivalent of throwing a bedpan out the window and declaring, "I choose guitars." The funny thing is, Mick wasn't immediately a rock god the moment he left the hospital. Nope. First, he had to dive into the messy underworld of early gigs. And let's be clear, those gigs were nothing glamorous. If hospitals smelled like disinfectant, early rock clubs smelled like stale beer, burnt amps, and maybe one confused goat. Don't ask. Rock clubs were weird. But Mick, with his porter training, was ready. He'd been lugging heavy hospital equipment all day, so carrying speakers and drum kits felt like child's play. He'd been calming nervous patients, so dealing with drunk audiences was just another version of the same skill. The only difference was, instead of saying, "Don't worry, the doctor will see you soon," he now said with his eyes, "Don't worry, the band will blow your mind soon." On stage, Mick unleashed the moves he'd been hiding in the hospital corridors. No more holding back. Suddenly, that walk down the ward became a strut across the stage. That little head tilt to check on a patient became a headbang. The rhythmic wheel squeak he once pushed became the beat to which his hips swayed. Nurses once whispered, "That kid's a bit strange." Now audiences shouted, "That kid's a legend." And Keith Richards? He was the perfect partner in this transformation. If Mick was the guy who brought swagger, Keith was the guy who brought riffs sharp enough to cut through any hospital bandage. Together, they weren't just making music, they were constructing a monster. A rock and roll Frankenstein stitched together with rhythm, rebellion, and a complete lack of bedtime curfews. Of course, success didn't happen overnight. There were awkward shows, broken amps, and tiny crowds. But every misstep only sharpened Mick's instincts. Compared to cleaning up after unpredictable patients, handling a bad gig felt like a vacation. And unlike in the hospital, where people mostly wanted silence and order, here people demanded noise, chaos, and swagger. It was the perfect environment for a future Rolling Stone. Looking back, it almost feels like Mick's hospital years were a boot camp designed by the universe. Bedpans became drum kits, gurneys became stages, the uniform became glittery shirts, and the shy porter with too much energy became the loudest frontman on earth. He wasn't famous yet, but you could feel the storm coming. The world didn't know it, but rock and roll had just stolen a hospital employee and turned him into its wildest showman. By the time the Rolling Stones began exploding onto the scene, Mick Jagger had already perfected his medicine. Equal parts swagger, chaos, and pure electricity. Fans didn't come for calm. They came for the diagnosis of eternal rock fever. If the hospital once trained him to keep patients still on a stretcher, now the stage demanded the opposite, to make thousands of people lose control at once. Picture it, lights blasting, guitars snarling, and Mick struts onto the stage like a surgeon about to perform open-heart rock surgery. Except instead of a scalpel, he's got a microphone. Instead of gloves, he's waving his arms like a manic traffic cop. And instead of patients lying down, the entire crowd is on its feet screaming, sweating, and begging for more. It was chaos disguised as performance. But Mick had been training for this without even realizing. In the hospital, he'd learned how to move quickly through tight spaces. Now he dodged Keith's guitar swings and leapt across amps. He'd learned how to project calm in tense situations. Now he projected madness with absolute confidence. And those squeaky gurney rhythms? They had evolved into one of the tightest rhythm sections in rock history. Fans couldn't believe their eyes. Was this guy even human? His dance moves were part duck, part peacock, part, did he just slip on a banana peel? But the crowd didn't laugh. They copied him. Overnight, Mick's strange little hospital hallway shuffles became the blueprint for rock and roll showmanship. Who needed choreography when you could invent your own species of movement? Meanwhile, backstage life was its own hospital ward, minus the rules. Instead of IV drips, there were rivers of whiskey. Instead of prescription pills, there were, well, let's say, creative medicine. And instead of nurses shouting, "Quiet, please," there were fans screaming until they fainted. Mick thrived in this madness because he'd already survived the unpredictability of patients, emergencies, and night shifts. Rock and roll chaos was just a new kind of emergency room, and Jagger was the doctor who always had the cure: more music. Critics said the Stones were too wild, too dirty, too rebellious. Mick didn't care. He had already traded sterile hallways for sweaty arenas. He knew life was louder when the rules were broken, and every time he strutted across the stage, he carried with him a tiny reminder. Once upon a time, he pushed beds. Now, he pushed boundaries. From the hospital floor to the world's biggest stages, Mick's transformation was complete. He wasn't a porter anymore. He wasn't just a singer. He was the Rolling Stone that refused to stop rolling. Looking back, it's almost impossible to imagine Mick Jagger in a hospital uniform. The man who strutted across the planet like he owned every stage once walked hospital corridors, pushing squeaky gurneys. If that's not the greatest career plot twist ever, what is? But here's the secret ingredient. Without those hospital days, there might never have been that Mick Jagger. Think about it. The discipline of night shifts became the stamina for all-night concerts. The patience with cranky doctors became the patience for cranky bandmates. And let's be real, keeping up with Keith Richards is like keeping up with a hurricane. The rhythm of the squeaky wheels became the rhythm of the Rolling Stones. It's absurd, it's cartoonish, and yet, it makes perfect sense. Mick didn't just leave the hospital behind. He carried it with him in the most ridiculous ways. When he stomped across the stage, it wasn't just dance. It was a reenactment of dragging a gurney uphill. When he pouted into the microphone, maybe it was the same face he made when a patient complained about bad hospital food. When he shook the world with his voice, maybe he was just practicing yelling orderly on the way, but louder, sassier, and with more glitter. And that's the beauty of his story. Mick Jagger proves that even the strangest, most ordinary jobs can sneak into your destiny. One day you're wheeling a patient to radiology, the next you're wheeling an entire generation into rebellion. One day you're surrounded by antiseptic and clipboards, the next you're drowning in screaming fans and guitar riffs. The line between ordinary and legendary? Sometimes it's just one hospital corridor away. Now, decades later, Jagger is no longer the skinny porter with restless energy. He's the eternal frontman, the icon who never stops moving, the human gurney of rock and roll. Unstoppable, loud, and slightly absurd. Fans don't just see a singer. They see a man who turned pushing beds into pushing boundaries, who turned sterile silence into endless sound. So what's the final diagnosis? Mick Jagger's hospital days weren't wasted time. They were training, comic, bizarre, and absolutely essential. The world got a Rolling Stone, but somewhere deep down, hidden behind the sequins and the strut, there's still a hospital porter reminding him, keep moving, keep the rhythm, and never, ever stop rolling. And Mick never did.